The sun hung high above the flat Texas plains, its glare bouncing off corrugated tin and the white dust of the corral. It was the summer of 1944, and the war's noise was an ocean away. Yet here, miles from any battlefront, stood a row of German prisoners of war, shirts rolled, eyes squinting, boots sinking into dry soil. They had arrived at dawn, silent under the watch of two armed guards and a ranch foreman in a sweat-darkened hat. The smell of mesquite drifted across the yard, curling from a rusted drum where meat slowly turned on wire racks. It wasn't charity. It wasn't rebellion. It was the foreman's idea, a lawful barbecue within the rules, rationed meat counted, portions exact, no favors given. But as the first plates clattered, something shifted. Faces once hard with suspicion softened. The guards eased their grip. The prisoners ate, nodded, and worked harder than they had in weeks. No speeches, no promises, just smoke, heat, and a quiet understanding born under a ruthless sun. By mid-1944, America had become a strange kind of fortress. Its factories thundered night and day, ships rolled off coastal docks, and the sound of sawmills and tractors filled the inland states. But while the machines of war grew louder, the fields had fallen quiet. Millions of young men were overseas. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, and the land that had once depended on their hands now struggled to keep its rhythm. Wheat still had to be cut, cotton had to be picked, rail ties had to be laid, but the arms to do it were missing. The War Department's solution arrived not with celebration but with quiet practicality: prisoners of war. By the summer of 1944, more than 400,000 captured Germans were scattered across the United States, housed in over 500 camps stretching from Maine to California. Texas alone held nearly 50,000. They were soldiers once loyal to a distant Führer, now to UNISA, burned into reluctant farmhands, carpenters, and mill workers. For the most part, they followed orders with stoic discipline. Their presence was legal, anchored in the Geneva Convention of 1929, which permitted prisoner labor so long as it was non-military, humane, and paid a fair wage through camp canteens. On paper, it looked efficient. The government got its labor force, farmers got their help, and prisoners received structure, food, and protection from the chaos back home. But in practice, every detail was delicate. The rules were strict: no fraternization, no gifts, no sharing of food beyond the issued rations, and above all, no perception of favoritism that might offend the American public or violate the law. Every morning, under the supervision of the U.S. Army Service Forces, trucks left the compounds carrying groups of 20 or 30 POWs out to fields, mills, and ranches. Each truck had a guard, usually one or two soldiers, sometimes older men unfit for frontline duty, sometimes veterans returned from combat. The journey was long, dusty, and silent. The prisoners, seated on wooden benches in the back, looked out at a land that seemed endless, fences running to the horizon, fields shimmering in heat, windmills creaking like slow metronomes. At the gate of each farm or ranch, a work detail would be handed over. The guards carried carbines, though few ever fired a shot. The POWs knew escape was pointless. Even if they reached a town, the distances and language barriers would defeat them. So they worked, methodically, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes with quiet pride in the simple precision of physical labor. But there was something fragile about the system. The work depended not only on orders and pay chits, but on mood. The Geneva Convention said labor must be voluntary, yet in reality, voluntary was a gray area. The camps relied on motivation, some mixture of boredom, fairness, and routine to keep the men willing. When morale dipped, sign-ups fell. A farm without enough workers would lose crops. A unit commander would have to explain the shortage. And a rumor of mistreatment could spread fast, reaching inspectors from the Red Cross or the War Department. That's why men like the ranch foreman in our story mattered. He wasn't an officer or a bureaucrat. He was a working man who understood people better than regulations. He had seen tired horses, stubborn cattle, and men pushed too far to care. He believed morale wasn't built by orders. It was earned through respect that didn't need words. Still, there was risk in being too humane. The line between decency and disobedience was razor thin. A guard could file a report. A farmer could be accused of pampering prisoners. Even a gesture as small as offering water in the wrong container could draw scrutiny. The foreman knew this. He read the pamphlets distributed by the camp authorities, lists of do's and don'ts printed in block letters. He followed them. He didn't break rules. He worked within them, looking for a way to bridge the gap between duty and decency. That gap on a dry Texas afternoon would be filled by smoke from a simple fire pit. The idea came quietly, maybe after watching the men wipe sweat with trembling hands, or noticing how they paused at the smell of food drifting from the ranch kitchen. He understood that food wasn't just sustenance, it was equality, even if for a brief moment. So he found a legal way to give them something better than routine. The barbecue that day wasn't generosity, it was calculation mixed with empathy. Within regulation limits, rations were combined and cooked on site to save transport effort. The meat was counted, logged, and stamped by the guard. Yet for the prisoners who ate it, the flavor was something they hadn't felt in months, dignity. And for the Americans watching them work afterward, the difference was visible. The ranch's productivity numbers didn't lie. Fences rose faster, fields were cleared earlier. Something about that smoky afternoon began changing the rhythm of the camp rosters in the weeks to come. The daily rhythm of the prisoner work program was built on routine so precise it bordered on ritual. At sunrise, bugles sounded inside the camps, echoing across barbed wire and wooden barracks. Prisoners lined up for roll call, issued with lunch tins, gloves, and water containers. Guards checked tools, trucks, and attendance sheets. Then, under the watchful eyes of the Army Service Forces, the convoys rolled out toward distant farms and ranches. For the Germans, it was an odd kind of exile. Many were trained soldiers, some from the Africa Corps, others from the crumbled divisions that once fought across Europe. Now they carried shovels instead of rifles, mending fences and harvesting crops in a land that had never seen a bomb. For many, it was the first time they encountered America, not in uniform parades, but through the sweat of farm work and the sound of radio music drifting from barns. Each site was monitored with military precision. A guard's report covered everything: arrival time, hours worked, breaks taken, injuries sustained, and rations consumed. Every transaction was documented to the ounce. POWs were paid with credit chits, tokens redeemable only at camp canteens for cigarettes, soap, or postcards. It was a system designed to maintain control while allowing a faint illusion of normal life. Yet life outside the wire, even for a few hours each day, had an effect. The prisoners saw civilians again, farmers, wives, children, ordinary people whose manner was often neither hostile nor warm, just cautious. For the locals, the sight of Germans working under guard was strange at first, but soon became routine. They learned that the men in khaki with white-painted PW on their backs were not monsters but weary soldiers who, when given a fair task, worked steadily and silently. Still, beneath that uneasy peace was tension. Every camp commander worried about fraternization. The Army circulated leaflets warning civilians not to give POWs extra food, tobacco, or conversation. "They are not guests," one bulletin read. "They are enemy personnel under control." But reality, especially in small rural towns, did not always follow memos. Humanity had a way of slipping through cracks in regulation. When summer temperatures rose past 100 degrees, water discipline became vital. Men fainted in the fields. Guards rotated shifts under shade. The smell of hot metal and sweat lingered over every worksite. That was when fatigue began to show. Less chatter, slower movements, tempers short. Even without cruelty, morale could collapse under the weight of monotony. Supervisors, often civilians like the cowboy foreman in this story, walked a careful line. Their job was to get the work done without provoking complaint or inspection. They had to balance firmness with practicality. The best of them learned to read the subtle cues. A man's posture at the fence line, the way a group moved when tired, the quiet resentment that built when food ran short or breaks were cut. The foreman knew that fatigue could make men reckless. He'd seen it before in ranch hands. When the body breaks, pride follows. That's why he began organizing the day differently. Instead of rigid schedules, he allowed short pauses, brief water breaks that didn't cost output. He spoke to the guard sergeant, explaining it saved time and accidents. It was a small compromise wrapped in logic. And it worked. Productivity rose slightly, and no rules were broken. Encouraged, he looked for other legal gestures within the same boundaries. The Geneva Convention allowed POWs the same ration quality as U.S. troops when possible. So why not cook it on site instead of delivering it cold? Why not make the meal practical for outdoor work rather than camp-style mess food? The barbecue trick started as logistics. Meat stored nearby stayed safer in heat. But once that smoke began to drift across the field, the effect was unmistakable. The POWs noticed. So did the guards. There was no conversation about kindness or peace, just a shared break in the heat, the smell of real food cooking, and the sound of tin plates waiting to be filled. Later, reports noted fewer sick calls, fewer disputes. No official paper credited the barbecue, it wasn't even mentioned. But word traveled through the camp that the ranch with the Cowboy cook had better working conditions. Volunteers began requesting that detail. In an operation built on rules and suspicion, a small act of lawful humanity had become its own quiet form of leadership. The war still raged overseas, but out on the plains, behind a fence of wire and dust, an invisible front line had shifted, one measured not in battles but in the space between distrust and dignity. War strips men of identity long before it takes their weapons. For the German prisoners scattered across the American interior, the loss was both external and silent. They no longer carried rank or insignia, only stenciled letters, PW, across their backs. They lived by the whistle, the count, and the rulebook. Yet inside that rigid order, their humanity persisted in small, stubborn ways. Each man carried his own private ache. Some had left families under bombardment, others had watched friends die in North Africa or Normandy. A few were teenagers, too young to understand how the world had shifted beneath them. For them, labor in the fields was a strange relief. No artillery, no orders shouted in panic, no air raids, just work, sweat, and silence. What they missed most wasn't freedom, it was normalcy. The smell of bread, a newspaper, a spoken word that didn't come from a command. They longed for purpose, not pity. And in the Texas heat, they found fragments of it in labor that felt useful, mending fences, hauling hay, tending herds. It was work that made sense, unburdened by ideology. When the cowboy foreman treated them as hands rather than enemies, it awakened something they hadn't felt in years: self-respect. For the guards, too, humanity blurred the edges of duty. Many were older men, fathers or veterans themselves, who saw in these young Germans reflections of their own sons. They followed orders but not cruelty. War had taught them that discipline could exist without hatred. That quiet decency, shared across barbed wire, became the unspoken foundation of the program's success. The barbecue was never about generosity. It was a signal in smoke and simplicity that dignity didn't need translation. On the ranch, labor was strategy. Every movement was timed with the rhythm of heat and daylight. The foreman ran his operation like a campaign. Logistics, morale, execution, he knew efficiency didn't come from barking orders but from keeping men upright, hydrated, and focused. The German prisoners, trained to follow routine, adapted quickly. They understood chain of command, tool maintenance, and cooperation. Once distrust faded, their discipline became an asset. They could fence an acre in half the time of untrained help. The foreman adjusted tasks like a tactician, assigning stronger men to posts, rotating shifts, preventing exhaustion. The guards observed but rarely intervened. Their rifles were more symbol than threat. The barbecue trick fit into this tactical logic. Instead of hauling food from camp, cold and rationed, it was cooked near the site. Time saved meant more labor done before the sun peaked. The smell of meat drifting across the field had an unintended psychological effect. It signaled abundance where scarcity ruled. The men stood straighter, moved quicker, talked softly among themselves. The afternoon lag shortened. Even the guard sergeant, skeptical at first, noted the results in his report. No incidents, work completed ahead of estimate. In a war defined by destruction, this quiet optimization was its opposite: creation. Barbed wire had become boundary, not prison. Tools had replaced weapons. And the man who orchestrated it, a cowboy with weathered hands, had turned simple logistics into morale strategy. The trick wasn't smoke or flavor, it was understanding how pride could power labor better than fear. Behind every humane act during wartime stood a web of rules. The Geneva Convention of 1929, signed long before the current conflict, outlined how captured soldiers must be treated. The United States followed it meticulously, not out of sentiment, but out of principle. It stated that POWs could be put to work if tasks were not directly tied to the war effort and if they received equivalent rations to American troops. Pay was symbolic, cents per day, exchanged only for controlled goods. But it maintained the illusion of agency. Inspectors from the International Red Cross traveled from camp to camp, unannounced, noting everything from sleeping quarters to meal quality. Their reports shaped policy, and their approval mattered to Washington. Any sign of mistreatment could provoke diplomatic protest and risk retaliation against American prisoners held in Europe. So the system depended on discipline, oversight, and paperwork. Within that bureaucratic cage, small freedoms survived. Civilians like the ranch foreman had to log every ration used for POW meals, every work hour, every medical issue. He understood that if his barbecue drew suspicion, he'd be questioned. So he designed it within the rulebook. The meat was U.S. Army issue. He recorded in weight and consumed on-site. The fire pit was listed as a field cooking arrangement. The guard's signature sealed it as compliant. It was lawfulness turned into humanity. No one broke a rule, yet everyone benefited. The prisoners worked willingly, the ranch met its quotas, and the military inspectors found no violations. That was the quiet genius of the system when guided by conscience. It didn't need rebellion to do good. It only needed interpretation with empathy. The war's moral fabric was fragile, but moments like this stitched it back together, thread by thread. The paperwork stayed dry and technical, but between the lines was something no regulation could measure. The return of mutual recognition between men once sworn to destroy each other. True leadership in wartime doesn't always wear rank. On the Texas plains, it looked like a man in a sweat-stained hat, his boots coated with red dust, speaking few words and meaning everyone. The cowboy foreman wasn't part of the Army's hierarchy, but his influence stretched beyond the fences. He led by rhythm, by keeping order without force, by showing fairness that didn't need speeches. Every morning, he stood beside the guard as the prisoners unloaded from the truck. He greeted them with the same calm nod he'd give any worker. He didn't lower the guard's authority, but he never used fear to get results. Instead, he gave instructions as if expecting them to understand, to take pride in doing a job right. It was a quiet gamble that paid off. The men began to see him not as their captor, but as their supervisor, a man whose trust had to be earned through work, not submission. He understood the psychology of labor. The fastest way to lose respect was to humiliate. The fastest way to gain it was to demand excellence without cruelty. His barbecue trick wasn't softness, it was command through respect. In a place where rules replaced compassion, he managed to create both without breaking either. That balance, the discipline of a soldier and the empathy of a working man, was leadership at its rarest form, unspoken, lawful, and deeply human. Culture met culture in the strangest of settings, a Texas ranch where German soldiers worked under American sky. At first, everything clashed, the accent, the posture, even the rhythm of motion. The Germans, precise and methodical, moved like machines, Dr. Ivan by habit. The Americans, practical and relaxed, valued improvisation and endurance. Between them stood the foreman, a translator without words. Food became the first shared language. To the Germans, meals in camp were institutional, thin stew, hard bread, measured portions. On the ranch, when the foreman lit his fire pit, they saw something different. Smoke and smell spoke of home, even if the flavors were foreign. The slow-cooked meat reminded them of village gatherings, harvest feasts, and the simple dignity of sitting in open air. The foreman didn't know it, but his method touched something deeper than appetite. It touched memory. The guards noticed it too. Men who had worked half-heartedly now volunteered for longer shifts. They returned to camp tired but lighter in mood. Word spread. Some POWs joked in broken English about Texas hospitality. The officers ignored it, but the meaning was clear. They had been seen as men, not numbers. This small exchange of culture didn't erase the war, but it softened its edges. For a few hours, national pride, propaganda, and hatred evaporated into the smoke. It wasn't peace. It was coexistence, fragile but real. And in that coexistence lay the quiet power of culture itself, the ability to humanize without permission. Morality during war is measured not in grand gestures but in tiny lawful mercies. The Geneva Convention gave framework, but conscience gave meaning. The cowboy foreman didn't need to read philosophy to know right from wrong. He believed in fairness because the land had taught him that life broke those who ignored it. The same sun burned the guards and prisoners alike. The same dust coated every man's hands. His decision to treat the POWs as workers rather than enemies wasn't rebellion. It was clarity. He saw that decency cost nothing and returned everything. Each day they labored side by side, separated by rifles but bound by routine. By choosing to see their effort rather than their past, he quietly redefined the boundaries of wartime morality. No newspaper ever told this story. No citation was written for humane efficiency. Yet in a war often remembered for cruelty, the small acts of fairness carried their own unseen weight. When the war ended and those German prisoners were shipped back across the Atlantic, some wrote letters through Red Cross channels to the ranches where they had worked. Many were never delivered, but the few that arrived spoke of gratitude, not for comfort, but for being treated as men when dignity seemed extinct. The moral lesson wasn't about forgiveness or charity, it was about proportion, the idea that following the law wasn't enough unless the spirit behind it was honored too. The barbecue was legal, the compassion behind it was optional, and that choice made under a blistering sun with a handful of rations and common sense became a moral victory in a war that had forgotten what small victories looked like. In history books, the war's great turning points are measured in tonnage, divisions, and treaties. Yet on that quiet ranch, morality turned on a simpler axis, a man's decision to remain decent when no one required him to be. It was early August 1944 when the Texas heat reached its fiercest. The horizon shimmered white as if the land itself were burning without flame. The wind carried no relief, only dust that settled on skin and stung the eyes. The prisoners arrived before sunrise, the truck tires crunching over gravel, the guards already sweating beneath their helmets. It was another day of work, another test of endurance. The cowboy foreman stood by the fence line, hands on his hips, watching as the men climbed down one by one. He could read exhaustion like a language, slowed movements, lowered eyes, that dull rhythm of men pushing through habit. The war in Europe was far away, but fatigue here was its echo. These men had been soldiers once, and now they were laborers halfway around the world, chained to routine instead of orders. That morning, the foreman sensed the drop in morale. The previous day had been long and punishing, a stretch of fencing through rocky terrain that left palms raw and temper short. Even the guards looked worn. The sergeant in charge, an older man named Miller, muttered that the men were running on fumes. There was no official way to fix that. The rules didn't mention fatigue of the soul. But the foreman had a plan he'd been refining quietly, a lawful improvisation. The ranch had received a new shipment of rations from the Army Depot the week before, including standard cuts of beef. Normally, they'd be hauled back to camp, boiled blandly, portioned into tin trays. He proposed a different method, cook the M here on site, under direct supervision. It would save time, prevent spoilage, and feed the men fresh. It was practical, not personal. That was the key to keeping it within the rules. He'd already spoken with Sergeant Miller the night before. At first, the sergeant hesitated, worried about appearance, paperwork, the risk of overstepping. The foreman assured him everything would be logged, rations by weight, portions equal to camp standards, one meal only. "We'll call it field preparation," he said simply. Miller studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Just make sure it's done by the book." At mid-morning, as the sun climbed, the foreman began preparing the pit. He used an old oil drum cut in half, filled it with mesquite wood, and lit it carefully until smoke began to roll in slow curls. The prisoners paused their work, uncertain whether to look. A few exchanged quick glances, whispering in German. The smell drifted across the field, sharp, earthy, unmistakable. Miller stood watch, rifle slung across his chest, eyes scanning the men but softening as the smoke thickened. The foreman moved with quiet efficiency, turning meat on wire grates, checking temperature by instinct. It wasn't an act of kindness, it was habit, how he'd cooked for ranch hands his entire life. But this time, the audience was different. A row of captured soldiers who hadn't tasted a cooked meal outside camp in months. When the signal came for lunch, the men formed a line. No one spoke. The guard counted heads, marked names on a clipboard. The foreman, wearing gloves darkened by soot, handed out plates one by one, each with exact portions, no more, no less. The rules were sacred. He said little, only motioning for them to sit on the shaded side of the fence line. At first, the silence was heavy, almost brittle. The prisoners ate carefully, eyes flicking between the guards and the foreman. Then something subtle happened, a change in air, like tension breaking. One man, older and gray at the temples, nodded once and murmured, "Danke." The word wasn't forbidden. Miller didn't react. Another followed, then another. Soon there was a faint hum of conversation, low, cautious, human. The guards sat apart but relaxed. The foreman leaned against a post, chewing quietly, watching dust drift in thin sunlight. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The results were unfolding in the way the men carried themselves after they finished eating. They rose faster, with new rhythm, passing tools without hesitation. While Iraq resumed under the same sun, but the sluggishness was gone. The heat hadn't lessened, but its weight had. By late afternoon, the day's quota was surpassed. Fence posts stood straight, wire tight. The guard checked his watch, shook his head, and muttered that they'd finished nearly an hour ahead of schedule. No incidents, no refusals, no discipline problems, just quiet, steady completion. The foreman knew that something intangible had shifted. He didn't need a report to confirm it. As the trucks were loaded and the men climbed back aboard, he caught brief glances, acknowledgments, faint but unmistakable. Not gratitude, not friendship, just mutual recognition that the day had been different. That night, when Miller filled out his log sheet, he paused before the remarks section. Regulations required factual entries only. Still, he wrote a single sentence beyond the numbers. Work efficiency high, morale improved, recommend repeating field meal arrangement. It was the closest thing to approval the system could give. The next morning, the camp commander noticed the entry and raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Paperwork was clean, rations accounted for, no irregularities noted. The line between regulation and humanity had held firm, and within it, the seeds of change had quietly taken root. The barbecue trick, as the foreman later called it, wasn't a trick at all. It was understanding, the rare kind that sees morale not as luxury but as necessity. And for the first time that summer, the work detail's reputation in Camp Hereford began to spread beyond the fences. The following week began with the same routines, the same roll calls, the same rumble of trucks through the gate at dawn. But something invisible had changed. The prisoners stepped onto the soil with a steadier rhythm, their movements sharper, more deliberate. They no longer waited for orders with that dull stare of resignation. Instead, they moved as though the day held purpose again. Sergeant Miller noticed first. As the convoy drove along the dusty road, he leaned on the tailgate and scanned the faces. They looked cleaner somehow, not by hygiene, but by spirit. The constant guarded stillness had softened. They even stood taller during head count. When they arrived at the ranch, the foreman met them as usual, hat low, clipboard in hand, saying only, "Same line, same pace." It was all that was needed. The day unfolded with quiet efficiency. Work began on the western pasture, a long stretch of barbed fencing that had been delayed for weeks due to low morale. The ground was hard as concrete, the posts heavies. But the men attacked the job methodically. They split into pairs, one digging, one aligning. The sound of hammers echoed over the field like slow percussion. Even under the hammering sun, the tempo never broke. The foreman observed with practiced eyes. He didn't speak often, but when he did, it was to correct or guide, never to scold. He treated the prisoners as if they were seasoned ranch hands, expecting precision, not pity. That was his language of respect. The guards watched silently, rifles slung low, their vigilance now more symbolic than tense. By noon, the temperature soared past 105. The foreman gave the usual signal for break, 2 short whistles, and the men gathered under a patch of oak near the fence line. There was no barbecue today, but the memory of it lingered. Canteens passed from hand to hand, water glinting in the sun. One of the younger prisoners, barely 20, reached for his cap and nodded toward the foreman before drinking. It was a small gesture, but Miller caught it. Respect, unspoken, had replaced fear. After the short rest, work resumed. By mid-afternoon, they'd fenced nearly half a mile, far beyond expectation. The guards' notes later recorded an unprecedented pace. Output increased by 30%. No disorder, morale high. The numbers proved what words could not. Late in the day, as shadows stretched across the field, an accident tested that fragile trust. One of the prisoners, a mechanic from Bremen named Heller, misstepped near a pile of wire and sliced his hand open. Blood poured down his wrist. Instantly, Miller raised his hand for order, but before he could move, 2 other prisoners knelt beside Heller, tearing cloth from their sleeves to stop the bleeding. The foreman jogged over, calm but firm. He retrieved his own bandage kit from the truck and wrapped the wound himself. No shouting, no panic, just quiet precision. When the bleeding stopped, Heller looked up, pale but steady. He murmured, "Danke," almost embarrassed. The foreman only nodded, tightening the knot. "Back on the truck. You'll be fine." The others watched, then went back to work. The rhythm barely faltered. That evening, when they returned to camp, Miller submitted his report. He mentioned the injury, the quick response, and the foreman's composure. The camp medic confirmed it. Minor laceration, treated on site, no issue. But what wasn't written in any report was the tone among the prisoners that night. Then inside the barracks, conversation buzzed, a rare thing. They spoke about the foreman, about the way he treated them like men, about the day's success. For the first time in months, some even volunteered for the next morning's roster without persuasion. By the end of August, the Hereford detail had become the camp's most reliable unit. Requests for transfer to the Cowboy's crew, as it was called informally, rose steadily. Commanders noticed, inspectors took note. Even the Red Cross representative, visiting unannounced, recorded in his diary that morale among agricultural details in this sector appears improved, relations between guard and worker unusually cordial. The foreman, unaware of the quiet ripple his actions had caused, kept his focus where it had always been, on the land. He didn't see policy or propaganda. He saw work that needed doing. When he heard the guards mention the reports, he shrugged it off. If they're doing better, it's because they want to, not because of me. But deep down, he knew leadership had less to do with orders than example. The weeks rolled on, the fields filled with bundled hay, the fences gleamed under the evening sun, and the trucks carried back men who, for a few hours each day, had remembered what it meant to choose their labor instead of enduring it. The war raged on elsewhere, Normandy, Arnhem, the Ardennes soon, but on that quiet Texas plain, another kind of battle had been quietly won, the battle to preserve humanity amid obedience. When September came, new work details arrived, fresh faces, recently captured soldiers. They were wary, bitter, uncooperative. Yet within days they adjusted to the rhythm the others had built. They followed the example, not the orders. The culture of the crew had changed from within. At the end of the season, when the POW program rotated men to different sites, Miller shook the foreman's hand before leaving. "You did something here," he said simply. "Not sure what to call it." The foreman smiled faintly. "Just kept things fair," he replied. "That's all a man can do." Neither knew their quiet system would later be studied by administrators and sociologists who tried to explain why some POW units outperformed others. They'd call it voluntary compliance, positive reinforcement, or controlled trust. But on the ranch, it had another name, a day's work done right. And for those who lived it, the memory of that smoky afternoon, where law, labor, and decency found common ground, would linger long after the war's thunder faded across the ocean. The war in Europe raged on, but out on the plains of Texas, its echoes grew quieter with each sunrise. The POW labor program had become a rhythm of its own, trucks rolling out at dawn, tools clattering, guards counting heads, and ranchers marking the day's yield. Among them, the cowboy foreman's detail stood out. What had begun as an experiment in practicality now showed results that no policy paper could explain. His fields. D reports looked like any other. Number of men, hours worked, tasks completed. But behind those lines of ink was a shift that statistics couldn't capture. Productivity had risen nearly a third since the barbecue trick. Absenteeism dropped. Requests for voluntary work, once a chore to enforce, now filled the list days in advance. Even the guards who once dreaded the monotony found the assignment easier. There were no fights, no disobedience, no escape attempts. The land itself seemed calmer. The Army supervisors noticed. During an inspection in late August, an officer from the 8th Service Command visited the site. He was tall, efficient, and skeptical of anything that deviated from regulation. He watched the work detail for half an hour, jotting notes in silence. Then he asked Miller, "What's your method?" The German prisoners returned home, many to shattered cities and uncertain futures. Yet the lessons they carried from that Texas ranch survived in memory. Some wrote years later, recalling not the wire or the watchtowers, but the warmth of smoke on a hot day, the steady voice of a man who treated them like workers instead of enemies. For the foreman, life went on. The fences he built remained, the fields grew again, and the letter he received from across the ocean stayed folded in his desk drawer. He never saw it as heroism, only as good sense. But history has a quiet way of honoring the unspoken. In the decades that followed, when scholars studied the POW labor program, they often wondered why some camps thrived while others struggled. The answer, though hidden in the paperwork, was simple. Humanity works better than hate. The Geneva Convention could enforce law, but it took conscience to give it meaning. And so, beneath the dust of that distant summer, a small truth endures. When dignity is offered even in captivity, war loses a little of its power. Sometimes the greatest victories are not won on battlefields, but in the moments when one man decides to remain kind when the world no longer requires it. Sight that morning. Still, Heller removed his cap and held it briefly to his chest, a silent farewell to a man who had treated him not as an enemy but as a worker, equal under the sun. Letters trickled in months later through the Red Cross network. Some were brief, simple thanks written in halting English. One stood out. It arrived addressed only to the rancher near Hereford, Texas. Inside, a single paragraph read, "You did not know our names, and we did not know yours. But we remember the day you fed us with fairness. It taught us more than orders ever could. Wherever I live now, that day will remain with me." The foreman never spoke of it publicly. He kept the letter folded in his desk, yellowing over the years. To him, it was just proof that decency had reached across a language no one had planned to share. By 1946, the camps emptied, the trucks stopped rolling, and the fences came down. What remained were traces, faint tire marks in the dirt, patches of grass that grew where work crews once stood, and a story that lived quietly among locals. They said the POWs at the Hereford Ranch had worked like free men, not captives. No one ever called it kindness. It was just good sense, they said, and maybe that was truer than any decoration or speech. Years later, when the war was only memory, those who had been there, guards, farmers, even a few returned German men, would speak of that summer with a strange tenderness. They didn't remember the rules or the reports. They remembered the smell of mesquite smoke and the feeling for one brief afternoon that even in war, there was still room for decency to breathe. When the war finally ended, the world celebrated victory in cities filled with flags, parades, and music. But far from the noise on the quiet plains of Texas, the memory of one unrecorded victory lingered, the kind that required no medals and no speeches. It was the victory of understanding. The story of the Cowboy's barbecue trick was never about food or cleverness. It was about a moment when a man chose respect over indifference. In a war built on division, he found a way to build order through decency. That choice didn't end the conflict, but it softened its edges. It reminded everyone, guards, prisoners, and civilians, that the line between humanity and hostility is drawn not by nations, but by the decisions of ordinary people. The guards, the prisoners, and the foreman all carried that lesson differently. For some, it was pride in a job done well. For others, a memory of humanity rediscovered in an unlikely place. None could have known that these small gestures would outlast the war itself, echoing in reports, letters, and memories long after the fences came down. When the last of the harvest ended and autumn winds began to roll across the plains, the war's tides finally began to turn. News traveled slowly to the camps, but even behind fences, everyone knew Germany was collapsing. The prisoners heard it in the guards' radios, saw it in their faces, and felt it in the air, the kind of silence that comes before history changes. Yet at Camp Hereford and the ranches that surrounded it, daily life went on. The trucks still left each morning, engines coughing in the cool dawn, carrying men who no longer saw themselves as enemies but as laborers finishing a strange chapter of their lives. Their discipline remained intact, but the tension that once filled every gesture had thinned. Even in captivity, the idea of survival had been replaced by something quieter, endurance. The Cowboy's crew had become the camp's model. The reports stacked up, efficiency high, morale strong, zero incidents. The War Department, eager to show the world that America upheld its values even in war, used such examples in internal briefings. Officials never mentioned names, but every man involved knew who they were talking about. The foreman remained indifferent to attention. He measured success not in praise, but in finished work. His focus stayed on the land, the miles of repaired fencing, the cleared fields, the barns ready for winter. When asked about the prisoners, he'd shrug. They did what they were asked. That's all a man can do. But behind his simplicity was quiet pride. He'd proven that fairness could move mountains far, stir than fear. For the prisoners, the end of their captivity came gradually. In 1945, as the Allies advanced and surrender loomed, orders began circulating to prepare for repatriation. Processing centers were organized, names were called, belongings counted, and trucks rerouted not to the fields but to the railheads that would carry them home. The men who had once stepped into the Texas heat as strangers now looked back at it with something close to affection. When the final roster was posted, Heller, the mechanic whose hand the foreman had bandaged, stood in the line, his palm still scarred but healed. He turned once before boarding the truck, scanning the horizon. The foreman wasn't there, out working another. Miller hesitated, unsure how to phrase something that wasn't in the manual. "Nothing special, sir. The foreman keeps it fair, feeds them right by the book." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Feeds them right?" Miller showed him the ration logs, perfectly balanced, every ounce recorded. The officer flipped through, found no infraction, and closed the folder. "Keep it that way," he said curtly. He didn't know that fairness, not fear, had become the invisible engine of the operation. For the prisoners, the transformation was subtle but profound. They were still captives, still surrounded by wire, but the daily rhythm gave them something war had taken: purpose. Each morning when the trucks rattled toward the horizon, the land stretched before them like a promise of routine instead of chaos. They worked, sweated, argued quietly, then finished the day exhausted but grounded. They were no longer fighting for survival. They were laboring toward dignity. Letters, censored and delayed, began to reach families back in Germany. Some mentioned the strange kindness of Americans. "We work on farms," one wrote, "and the men are not cruel. It is hot, but we eat well. They treat us as workers, not prisoners." The words carried across the Atlantic, a quiet contradiction to the propaganda that painted their captors as monsters. At the ranch, the foreman never changed his methods. He didn't repeat the barbecue every week. He didn't need to. The men now trusted the fairness of the system he built. They knew their efforts would be met with respect, not humiliation. That balance became its own fuel. By October, harvest season reached its peak. The ranch posted record yields despite the shortage of local labor. The Army Liaison Office took notice and requested interviews for a morale survey. The foreman declined politely, saying only, "It's not a story, just work done right." Yet the story traveled anyway. Nearby ranches began experimenting with similar arrangements: field-prepared meals, shade breaks, flexible rotations, all within regulation. Word spread quietly through the network of agricultural details. What started as one man's practical choice became an unofficial model across parts of the Southwest. To the outside world, none of this mattered. Newspapers wrote about the front lines in France and the Pacific. The quiet revolution in Texas fields went unnoticed. But for those who lived it, it was a small victory, the kind that didn't win medals but mended something deeper, the understanding that decency, even inside the machinery of war, could multiply when given a little room to breathe.